Good afternoon to everybody. So we can get started with this last session of this extraordinary schooling. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Odile Eisenstein. Odile Eisenstein is an emeritus research director at the CNRS at the University of Montpellier, and also she works at the University of Oslo, Norway. She's got an incredible career and with many high distinctions. I would like to mention, amongst the other, the fact that she became the first woman admitted to the chemistry section of the Academy of Sciences in 2013 in France. And she was also the second foreign citizen who was awarded the ACS Organometallic Award, which is a very important award in organometallic sector. And she was also nominated the French Legion of Honor and many other high distinctions. She's got the education in Zurich with Dönitz, the ETH, and then he joined the Roald Hoffmann as a postdoc at the Roald Hoffmann Group at Cornell in the United States. And you all know that Roald Hoffmann was 1981 Nobel laureate in chemistry. So her work is in the computational chemistry, in the modeling of the structure and the reactivity of complexes of transition metals and lanthanides. So please, the talk of today is solvent-to-all organometallic reaction. Please, Odile.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to start by thanking Maurizio and Claudio for beating the COVID by maintaining this school. I was in presence, in real, not in virtual, several years ago. And I remember it was a very enjoyable place. And I wish I had gone again and be there. It's better to see people, but it's better to do this way than nothing. I am also very grateful to have a Sunday active scientific meeting. And I am grateful to those who attend this at this time of day. Okay, so I'm a computational chemist interested in organometallic reaction, which is the heart of the school. And I will talk today about the role of the solvent on mechanism. So there will be a little bit of generalities on modeling the solvent, very few, no equations. Selected example out of work to highlight the importance of solvent. And I will spend a good part of this talk talking about what I have done in collaboration with Michele Cascella, who is an Italian citizen working in Oslo, and is a real computational chemist from the Parinello group. And all together, we work at this very important reagent and reaction. And I think we had fun showing them what the solvent does. So first of all, I want to point out that although we all believe chemistry occurs in solvent, that it is not always the case, and you should not forget as chemists that there is chemistry which is out of solvent. You should not forget astrochemistry, which by definition has no solvent. I'm not going to spend more than just pointing some key references and the fact that it's important for organic, astrobiology, spectroscopy, and even water chemistry. So you can ask me reference if you want. I also need to point out there is a whole section of chemistry which is usually occurring gas phase and analyzed by mass spectrometry, which is basically involving sharp species occurring without solvent or occurring with a very well-controlled number of solvent molecules. The big players there are Helmut Schwarz and Peter Chen, and it's actually an interesting topic by itself to compare the pathway which are occurring gas phase to those which are occurring in solvent. But this is a topic I am not going to go to the species which are studied by mass spectrometry, which are usually small ions. But this is a very important point because how much gas phase tell you about solution chemistry is a key issue also in chemistry for understanding. So a very simple idea, why do we need a solvent? Well, the solvent is indeed needed, in particular since most of the chemical species have either a total or partial charge. And in vacuum, charge, positive and negative charge like to stay together. So charge separation is energy costly, and it's going to be very different, of course, as soon as you add a solvent. So if you add a solvent, you can actually start to separate the charge, which is going, of course, to be important in all, for real charge system, for polar system, and for any chemical transformation which involves transfer of charge group or actually change in the structure of polar groups. So this actually raises a very interesting question, and you can ask me questions at the end of the talk, is that for computational chemists, as you're going to see, it's not so easy to take care of the solvent. So there is a tendency to try to do it the easy way. And one of the easy ways, actually, I do the calculation in vacuum for identification of minima and transition state. And after that, I just add the solvent on their geometry, and I hope I get it right. I would say be very, very careful with that. It can be okay, but you may be lucky, and it can be really very wrong. If you have very strongly charged species, geometry will be very different in vacuum and solvent. So you cannot assume that the geometry of your minima and transition state will be the same. So for the moment, it's still accepted in the literature, but it's going to be more and more questionable. And this, you can get upset referee, which is never very pleasant. So one has to actually realize that trying to include the solvent in modeling is not so old. Basically, it's a kind of turn of the century or turn of the millennium, where people realize that they really should do something better than just calculating species in gas phase. They actually did calculate species in gas phase because honestly, they couldn't do anything better. And you could say, well, if you include the solvent, how do you do it? So I decided to take one very nice example out of an incredibly well-known chemist, Bob Crabtree, with an incredibly well-known computational theoretical chemist, Pierre Sigban. And in 1997, so not so long ago, they asked themselves a very simple question. Why is solvent important in organolithium chemistry? This was an experiment done by Dave Collon at Cornell, and he found that basically adding THF was actually accelerating very strongly the simple reaction which is shown here, which is the exchange of lithium and halide, and basically halide. So lithium is bound to R blue on the left, and is bound to R prime red on the right. I don't have a pointer, so I have to replace pointer by words. So they did a simple calculation, and it's so obvious if you think about it. So they took a simple, again, it's 23 years ago. They took a simple methyl lithium, they took a simple iodide complex, they tried to bring them together. They located the transition state, which is a T-shaped transition state shown on the right. And they, of course, got geometry and energies. And they decided after that to redo the same calculation just with one solvent molecule. I mean, if you think about it, you must. I hope your hair goes straight up on your head, because I mean, one solvent for lithium, is that possible? Well, they did it, and it worked very well. Qualitatively, the transition state was significantly lower. And that was enough in 1997 to actually prove that solvent could accelerate the reaction. The reason was simple. If you think about chemistry, lithium needs to be surrounded by solvent, need to be in fact tetra-coordinated. And if you don't have solvent, you had really a naked, almost lithium atom, which was very, very unhappy, showing in a higher transition state. What was amusing, in fact, is that actually in this case, the structure were very similar with and without solvent, which is certainly something which I would not take as granted, but it was okay. I talked about this paper actually a week ago to prepare this talk with Bob Crabtree, and he actually believes that he found the essential trend, and I agree with him. He found the trend, but this is not sufficient now. We need to do better. We need to do quantitatively, go quantitatively, and we need probably to know better what the solvent does. But this is a very good example that simple model with actually could already pick up some essential trends. So things you have to keep in mind that for computational chemists, when you have large number of atoms, it's a difficult calculation, and it was very clear from the early start when we are in the 80s, 90s that you could not put really the solvent around the molecule. There was too many atoms. And as I said before, you didn't know if you had to put one molecule, two molecules, one solvent shell, two solvent shell, how to do it. So it was replaced that if you could actually model the solvent by a global effect, this will be good enough, and you will pick the essential, I would say, effect of it. And those were actually done in the 90s, and the key actors are actually at the beginning Tomasi and Baron in Italy, also Riva in France, and Kramer and Trullard, about at the same time and a little later. And the whole idea is that if you do not want to calculate solvent, you actually do what is called an implicit solvent. So solvent is not there in real with atoms. It's just represented by a continuum polarizable medium of dielectric constant epsilon. And basically it will stabilize the charge, and it will stabilize non-bonding effect and so forth. It works pretty well. And as we are going to see through some example, it picks up a lot of effect, but it does not pick everything. It works, of course, very, very well with solvent of low polarity. It works also with solvent of medium polarity. It works well with non-coordinating solvent. It becomes a problem as soon as the solvent takes an active role in the reaction. When you mean takes an active role, actually enters the coordination sphere of the species and basically change the structure, change the coordination, and start helping transferring atoms. One of the key actors there is, of course, the polar and protic solvent are some of those which are basically doing this kind of active role. So in that case, you could do something which was intermediate. You could actually put them as they are, and you have to decide how many atoms you have to put. This is your chemical intuitions. In this little model, you see 4 solvent molecules. You could do more. You can do as many as you want. It costs you every time more, and it's more difficult. And you also add a continuum effect to represent the global surrounding and stabilize this polar system. It was found to be essential for proton transfer, and I will show a couple of really, I would say, key examples showing how essential it is. Well, one of the problems there, it's called a cluster model. One of the problems there is very simple, is that you have to decide before how many molecules of solvent you put. And this decision is basically chemical, on one sense, how many you have your chemical intuition, which is sometimes very good, but also it's also more and more difficult to optimize. And this fact that the solvents are forced to stay there can be really a problem. So basically, the real way to do it will actually be to have a box of solvent in which you can actually allow the solvent to come in and go, and you don't have to decide a priori how many solvents are near your molecule. This will be decided by actually the solute, which will attract or push out solvent. Of course, the key people there are Carr Parinello, and they come from the physics community. But what they have done, mostly in biology, but now more and more also in chemistry, is very important. It's extremely powerful. It started slowly because it's very expensive and not easy to use. But I would say you are going to see through the several examples that it brings you interesting information, and you can think after that more about, I would say, the role of the solvent in a more open way. I'm going to take some examples which are not at all in our field of research, but are typical of what of great interest for chemists. One of the really most important reactions which has been studied recently is transfer hydrogenation. And the mechanism was proposed by Noyori. And let's look at what it is. It's basically what the whole point here is to try to remove the red hydrogen and the blue hydrogen from an alcohol and transfer it to an organometallic species. So this organometallic species here could actually either make H2, which can go, or actually transfer these two hydrogen to another acceptor, another ketone, another imine, or so forth, and you can actually do a lot of reaction. This is actually all of the reaction for asymmetric Noyori type chemistry has been done with this transfer of hydrogenation. So if you think in terms of, I would say, the simplest mechanism, it's quite obvious. Your metal is usually at an empty coordination site. This is absolutely essential because it has to accept a hydride. The next atom has to have a lone pair in order to be active. So this is a bifunctional system where you have a Lewis acid and a Lewis base. So you have your substrate, which has a protic hydrogen blue and a non-protic hydrogen. And it's quite obvious that you can write a very nice six-member ring that's been kind of mythical in chemistry. Each time you write a six-member ring, you think it's best. And you can write indeed a very nice concerted mechanism in which the red hydrogen goes to the metal, the blue hydrogen goes to nitrogen, and off you have dehydrogenated your alcohol. Here, formaldehyde, you can do that for any aldehyde or ketone. And after that, basically you think, oh, here, this is a blue protic hydrogen. It will love the hydride, so they can get next to each other and you can do H2. And it looks lovely. It was fantastic. Everybody took it. And calculation can be done. Problem is that you can do calculation and you obtain, indeed, values. You find values which are actually not abnormally, I would say, high, a bit high energy. And this was accepted for a long time, and it looks fine. Now, the fact is that by definition, this reaction is run in actually alcohol. This is by definition. So it is not on vacuum, it's not one molecule of alcohol, it's actually a solvent alcohol. So we can start with this paper, which is not so long ago. I'm not going to describe the past, it's just impossible, just to point out the philosophy of it. So this calculation were interesting because it's a calculation of the same mechanism, but in continuum model. So there is indeed not many alcohol. There is only one molecule of the alcohol, only one. But there is a continuum model, and this continuum model of solvents, which mimic the global effect of the solvent, will help you to stabilize local charge species. So in fact, in place of having only a few species, you are going to have a lot of possibility with charges which are going to be either on the oxygen, charges going to be on the metal, and charges going to be, so you are going to stabilize a huge amount of species. And by stabilizing the huge amount of species, of course, what you happen is that you are not going to stay on the simple concerted pathway. And you are going to start deprotonating there, then reprotonating over there, then doing basically non-concerted pathway all the time. And basically, you are going to see that the Noyori mechanism is just probably oversimplified. But there is one key problem here. There is only one molecule of solvent. I mean, the solvent is a substrate, so why do you put only one molecule of solvent? So this study was actually done, and I do not know, I don't see the date because of the way, but you probably see the date. It was the key actor there was Ever-Jan Meyer in Amsterdam, and he was going indeed to do ab initio molecular dynamics. So again, real solvent. We are going to see what it means, real solvent, and no limitations number of solvents, and indeed that Noyori reaction mechanism, which is indeed shown here, is one of the real systems you can use. And it's going to use methanol, and there will be a lot of methanol, and you are going to form formaldehyde and H2. So it's basically the same reaction as the Noyori, and we are going to see what's going on. One actually interesting point is the following, is that if you do actually represent the system properly, you find that the Noyori unsaturated species, which in principle should have nitrogen, non-protonated nitrogen, as I would say, as a substrate, it actually does not exist in the experimental condition. As soon as you put it in the solvent, the preferred species is a protonated already species. So you see immediately that you are going to have a problem because you are never going to be able to do the concerted reaction that you plan at the beginning because the species is not, in fact, existing in solution. So through this calculation, which is indeed allow as many solvents as you want to interact with the species and calculate properly all of the system, I don't need to give a technical talk here, and actually I'm even unable to give it, but to see some of the species here, you realize that you are going to have solvent all around the metal and the nitrogen. And if you think about it, everything is very logical. Near the ruthenium, you are going always to have a lone pair approaching. Okay? Makes sense, because the ruthenium is a Lewis acid. Near the protic hydrogen, you are going, of course, to have the solvent with usually the oxygen approaching. So typically, if you approach now your substrate, indeed you can approach your substrate, and you see that the hydrogen of the substrate approaches the ruthenium, but solvent stay around. And you can keep on studying. So you see here, at the next step, you see indeed the formaldehyde being formed. And what you see here, look at where this proton is on what was before the methanol. This proton is not pointing toward the nitrogen. It cannot point toward the nitrogen because there is already a proton on the nitrogen. So it points to another Lewis base. And indeed, the proton will go with somewhere else. You form the formaldehyde, and after that, indeed, what happens is that you wonder how you are going to form the H2. Remember, in Noyori species, Noyori mechanism, you were hoping that the hydrogen on the nitrogen joins the hydride on the ruthenium to make H2. Well, of course, protons are indistinguishable from each other, so it is not that proton which is going to come to the hydride, it's going to be another proton, which is indeed provided through the solvent. And you form H2, this is real, but you never form H2 without proton. And after that, H2 goes, and after that, you start again. So what you see here is that basically you have accomplished exactly the same reaction. Some key feature have been maintained is that the hydride was indeed coming from the alcohol, but the proton was coming from different sources. And you obtain now, I would say, free energies, which are difficult actually to compare to experiment. I don't know how much kinetics really was done, but which looks much more reasonable. And it makes sense indeed that solvents help in that reaction. So this kind of study could not be done easily otherwise than by this method in which you do not include a priori a number of solvents, because each time you actually have a different number of solvents, you have to have the solvent allowed to come in and go out at will, and the solvent solution to rearrange. I also like very much this other example from the same group in Amsterdam, because it's actually, I work at this reaction with Robin Perutz a few years ago, and indeed we realize now that system is not so easy. Look at that. You have two different mechanisms if you go through reactions through vacuum and indeed in water. So you start from a format complex and you want to form CO2. So basically how the hydrogen on the format will actually go to the ruthenium to form the ruthenium hydride and liberate CO2 is dependent, is different if you actually do it in vacuum. In that case, indeed, you have a force center rearrangement. If you do it in solvent, you have ion separation and rearrangement. And you could say, well, you could say, fine, and is it different? Well, yes, it is different. It's different, but in the same time, you can actually think over and realize something. Some aspects of the reaction really do not depend on solvent, and some do. And I think this is what we should keep in mind. Typically, in this transfer hydrogenation reaction, the hydride will always come properly and will actually be determined in the same manner, whatever is your method of calculation. It will go to the metal, and there is no way you are going to transfer a hydride with the help of a protic solvent. I mean, it goes to the metal, it's a Lewis acid. But the proton has so many ways to actually go and find its way back to the nitrogen that it is where it differs. So when people say it's different mechanism, I will only partly agree. I mean, again, talking with Bob Crabtree, he said proton, it doesn't matter where it comes from, and I tend to agree with him. Protons are species which can indeed be captured by many intermediate before arriving to the final destination. So is it different? Is it the same? It's a bit up to you, we can discuss. But indeed, the energy that you are going to calculate are very different depending on how you calculate. Now, I'm going to go, when did I start at, Alexandro? Just want to know how much time I have. I started at 1:45?
You started at 37.
37, okay, fine. So I'm going to focus now on the main part of the talk. Which is a Grignard reaction, because this is indeed a reaction which strongly depends on solvent. So for history reasons, let me say that 1912, shortly before the First World War, was beneficial for French chemistry. Victor Grignard got it for indeed a Grignard reagent which entered really organic chemistry and become essential. And Sabatier actually got it for catalysis and also made a lot of progress in chemistry. These two guys are important in our history in chemistry. We are going to stay with Mr. Victor Grignard. So the Grignard reaction is the addition of magnesium, I would say organometallic, to a ketone or aldehyde to form a carbon-carbon bond with the R group, which was originally on the magnesium. And with that, of course, you can form an alcohol after hydrolysis. The interesting point is that although this was now discovered so many years ago, basically the mechanism is essentially not understood, or I would say only partially understood. The nature of the reactive species was somewhat undefined, and the fact that they are actually so fluxional that you cannot really fish anything out. If you actually fish anything out, it may be not something which is actually exists in solution. And we know that actually the simple Grignard is actually is represented by R and JX, but this is actually a very simplified representation of something which is an equilibrium of several species. Only 3 are marked here, but we are going to see that many more. And indeed, they are basically exchanging R and X, so you make R2Mg and MgX2 from the organometallic original. How does this exchange occur? Nobody really knows. What is the role of the solvent, which has to be non-protic? Nobody really knows. So the Schlenk equilibrium was discovered by Fazer and Son in 1929. So calculations were done, and basically with, I would say, limited success. What was found is that basically you can probably, of course, magnesium is going to be surrounded by solvents, and in general, everybody agrees that magnesium has to be at least coordinated to 4 species, usually thought to be more or less tetrahedral. And interestingly, calculation with, I would say, cluster approach and a continuum could actually agree on that, but shows that depending on the number of X group on the magnesium, you could have actually a stronger effect of the solvent. Typically, a more polar MgX2 needs a greater solvation than a less polar R2Mg. Makes a lot of sense in terms of chemistry. Does it actually mean different number of solvent or stronger solvation? This is not so easy to determine with cluster subtract, but the calculation by this group of people from Finland, from Lithuania, has actually found that up to 4 solvents could actually coordinate to magnesium. So it's really, you realize immediately that you may have difficulty if you have to stay with a given number of solvents. How can you do that? So we took basically with Michele Cascella, I hope I say more or less it properly in Italian, we decided to do it the right way, what we hope to be a better way. So we decided that we are going to actually look at the Schlenk equilibrium in a box of solvent made of real CHF molecule. Our organometallic Grignard is going to be a simplest one, methyl magnesium chloride, and we are going to basically see how we can actually go to dimethyl magnesium and magnesium dichloride. So we took a large box of solvent, 25 THF molecule, and to make a long story short on the methodology, the solvent is free to do whatever he wants, and actually we can look at the transformation under this way. In terms of methods, we can discuss, but I'm not one of the best person. It's really a physics method. It's called ab initio molecular dynamic. Seeing that the solvent is properly represented. One thing which comes out seems to be already popular. You have actually not only stronger solvation, but a larger number of solvents on the more polar magnesium species, 3 solvents around MgCl2, only 2 solvents around either dimethyl magnesium or methyl magnesium chloride. So definitely, if you are going to look at the reaction, you realize that you may have to look at different number of molecules depending on exactly which species you are looking, which is a troublemaker for anyone who does calculations. So to actually look at the pathways with ab initio molecular dynamics, we have to think in a slightly different way. We are going actually to really calculate the free energy map, which is fine. We are not going to calculate an energy and calculate entropy after we have access directly to the free energy map. We are not going to search a pathway. We are going to see a map where you actually can guess a pathway. Think about that the statistic is properly represented and the solvent reorganization is actually well represented. So let's see what it means. I think it's best illustrated here with a map which describes here how many solvent molecules can surround this dimagnesium species, which is a dichloro bridge. Everybody believes that because magnesium prefers tetracoordination, you will have only one solvent. So this is species A, okay? Species A on this map is here, left corner, and what are CV1 and what are CV2? So CV1 and CV2 are actually the new way to think about pathways. They are not distances, they are basically what's actually a kind of a way to define the pathway in a more abstract way. CV1 close to 1 means one solvent molecule near magnesium. CV1 close to 2 is actually 2 molecules close to magnesium 1. Same definition for CV2, but on magnesium 2. So A has one solvent on 1 and one solvent of 2. C has 2 solvents on 1 and 2 solvents on 2. And you see here, the darker is a map, the more abundant number of species you have of this type. So you see right away that there is more species of A type than there is species of C type or B type. But what you see is that indeed, in solution, you have a fair amount of solvation by 1, 1 and 2, and 2 and 2. And this is going to be essential for the reaction to go. So here is a very complex way, but needed way to actually understand how the transformation is actually shown. We are going to start from the fact that the molecule is going to be to the dimer. We do not start from the monomer from technical reasons. We assume that the dimer is actually made, and the whole point here is actually to transfer one methyl from the left magnesium 1, to magnesium 2, and one chlorine has to go on magnesium 1. So basically, you start from a symmetrical species. Each magnesium has one methyl and one chlorine. The two are bridged, and you have to end up with species which are completely non-symmetrical, which are represented by E. On E, what you see is 2 blue methyl on the magnesium on the right, and the chlorine are already on the magnesium, on magnesium 1. It's not completely cleaved. This cleavage was not studied. It's kind of obvious it will occur. So what you see here is that there are going to be a lot of species which are going actually to go from a system which has 2 chlorine bridges to indeed a methyl on the right-hand side. And it is not going to be so easy. So A is the most abundant species, and A and B are in fast equilibrium. You see that it's almost flat. It's almost the same color. I mean, A and B just extend extremely fast. And after that, you go to a lighter blue, that is, you go up in energy. You go to a C species, and look at C species, you have a methyl bridged. So the methyl is halfway between Mg1 and Mg2. and after that you go to a D species, which is still halfway because it has also a bridge methyl and a terminal methyl, and you finally will go to E, which is the final product. And what differs there on all of these species are the number of solvents which we are going to put on magnesium 1 and magnesium 2. Those number of solvents, which are actually represented by CV1, which is different, by CV2, sorry, is actually going to determine the reaction. So this is going to be difficult for you to look at, so I'll give you the final, I will say, the summary of that. Okay, we get energies, but here is an interesting way. For each system, for each of the systems, we are going to be able to actually determine which of them have the weak bond and which do not have weak bond. So typically, a system which have a very strong bond, Mg chlorine bond, and short magnesium chlorine bond is not going to cleave a magnesium chloride. So typically, the red one, which is the most stable one, which is this one, will never cleave a magnesium chlorine bond. So the most stable A species will never give a Schlenk equilibrium. It will never be able to cleave the bond. But we find that one species is actually able to cleave bond, is actually the one which has 2 chlorine in the middle, and 1 THF on the left and 2 THF on the right. Very strange, this species has probability to have very long red magnesium chlorine bond. So this one has the ability to actually cleave the bond. And we need to understand that, and this probably, okay, this is summarized in this static, we don't have the film for this one. So what happened? You have your magnesium is bonded to 4 groups and only 1 THF. But in fact, this one is bonded to too many THF. So basically, he agrees to cleave a bond because he's a little too solvated. So indeed, this magnesium on the right, so the chlorine will actually cleave easily through this the TS, and after that you can move the methyl. So interestingly, it's because the magnesium on the left become actually unsolvated or lower solvated, and the magnesium on the right become oversolvated, that there is an imbalance in between the 2 bridges, and one of the bridges cleaves and the methyl can come in. And this is this kind of solvation in and out, which is going actually to promote the Schlenk equilibrium. So this is summarized by this global system, which you see how many species are involved in actually the very simple exchange between methyl and chlorine. You start on the methyl magnesium. You are going to form dinuclear dichloro with a variable number of solvents. And as soon as you have an imbalance, this is the second species called D1,2 chlorine, as a 1 THF on the left, 2 THF on the right, is going actually to start rearranging and allowing the methyl to come in. And after that, you have to unbalance again and desolvate this one to allow this one to cleave, magnesium-magnesium bond to cleave. So basically, the successive cleavage of magnesium chloride and magnesium methyl is going just to be promoted by solvent in and solvent out. Completely out of the game is a more stable species, which is just there as a repository. Nothing will happen to here. It cannot do anything. It has to be solvated in a different way to start rearranging. So what we know, we have a lot of species, and we understand it is promoted by the solvent. Okay, so now that we know we have so many species, can we understand a little bit of the reaction itself? So the reaction itself, I encourage everybody who wants to read about this reaction to read this beautiful essay by Dietmar Seifers on organometallics, published in 2009. I am sorry for those who did not know Dietmar Seifers passed away this year. A great miss for main group for organometallic chemistry and organometallics. And in this essay, which is beautifully clear, he actually pointed out that the reaction is extremely complex, but you can distinguish two pathways. One is nucleophilic addition, where the reactant is indeed R-, and one is single electron transfer, where the radical, actually the reagent, is R-. And which one is when? It was not obvious to extract from the literature, but this is a summary. Basically, nucleophilic mechanism dominate by far, but indeed, each time you had something like, I would say, a heavily conjugated ketone, like I would say benzophenone, you started to see product which could not derive from nucleophilic, from the Grignard reaction, like this dimer, which clearly indicated at some point that probably a radical of the benzophenone was formed. There was indeed, I know it in French, sorry, observation, RPA observation, and indeed very nicely, there is a study by Worpel in which he was really able to point out that single electron transfer do not occur with certain type of aldehyde or ketone, in general never occur for alkyl ketone and aldehyde, systematically occur for anything which is conjugated ketone, and in particular with a very heavily conjugated fluorenone. So why is that so, and how does it occur? Well, there was some computational chemistry done not so long ago with static approach, which pointed out that the reaction could go through maybe a dinuclear magnesium, and he identified a species where the metal transfer could transfer to the formaldehyde, which was a reactant. So this was done with a static approach and done well. You are going to see they were very, very close to what we found. So it was not bad. And they even identified a single electron transfer mechanism also involving the dinuclear magnesium species. But they could not interpret it why, and they said it seems that it is possible. Okay, let's do it our own way. So we are going to compare nucleophilic addition to single electron transfer, and we are going to try to know which of the species which are in solution are going to be reacted. The only thing I'm going to take as accepted is that the aldehyde will actually need to be coordinated to a magnesium in order to react. It needs to be electrophilically activated. If it is not coordinated, it is not sufficiently electrophile. This is the only hypothesis we put. So we published that into the JACS in January this year. So the approach was very simple. We took every substrate we actually obtained from the Schlenk equilibrium study. So all of the monomers which were identified, all of the dimers which were identified, in each of these species, each of them, we replaced one of the solvents by the aldehyde. And we took acetaldehyde as a possible reagent. And why is it perfectly logical? Both of them have oxygen which can be coordinated to magnesium, so it's quite obvious that dissolution will occur. For all of them, we actually determine through ab initio molecular dynamics, allowing the solvent really free to come in and out towards the free energy pathway. And we obtained two which were specifically reactive, one monomeric species with 2-methylone, and one dinuclear species with the substrate on the left and the methyl on the right. Why are those species so better than the other one? is a little bit what I will discuss, and what is the solvent role in both, we are going to see that. All other reactions are not very high, except this one is very, very high, but they are sufficiently high to be disregarded, or I'll say less favored. So typically, this is the one which has 2-methyl. The solvent is going to come in, and the transition state will actually occur only when the solvent is actually coordinated. So do I have time to show a film?
Yeah.
Okay. So here you are going to see what occurs for the dimethyl magnesium Grignard, and you are going to see how the solvent is going to promote the, I would say, the freedom around the species. Let's go. So the solvent is approaching. You say it takes time. You need all of the solvent reorganization. And you see that nothing yet is formed. But now you see this is now cleaved. You can go all the way, but you are going to form the final product. So, important point is that if you did not have the solvent, the dimethyl magnesium Grignard would not have reacted at all. It would have been much more higher in energy. This is even more fascinating. The dinuclear species is indeed extremely reactive. And now in terms of chemistry, it makes a lot of sense. Remember that your aldehyde has to be actually electrophysically activated. So it is on your left, it's coordinated to 1 magnesium, and it has to remain coordinated to magnesium in order to actually receive the methyl. But it is very far the way it is. So if the oxygen of the aldehyde actually becomes bridged, now you have 2 magnesium, which is actually coordinating to your aldehyde, become extremely electrophilic. In addition, this magnesium is now has too much ligand, and therefore the methyl will leave. So basically, there is a concerted way. Aldehyde comes in, basically gives too much electron to this magnesium, which is actually liberating a much more active methyl group. So this is a really very, very active species, the best aldehyde and the best nucleophile, and the film. Now, you see, you are forming that, and as soon as you form, the methyl jump. Do it again. It approaches. As soon as you form, the methyl jump. So this is exactly what's going on. You have here a system which is extremely reactive. You don't have any solvent which need to come in and out. All of the solvents are there, which of course in terms of free energy is extremely positive. The reaction becomes very, very reactive. So I'm actually almost not far to be done. Let's see what happened. We are able to put on the same scale all of the species, compare not only their barrier, but keep in mind that all of them have a different energy to get started. So if you want, the barrier needs to be considered with respect to the 0 line, which is the line at the bottom. And what you see is that you have one species, a dinuclear species, with a 4.8 above the second line and only just 1.3 kcal more relative to the more stable species. The most reactive species is this dinuclear species with the aldehyde on the left and the alkyl group on the right. And indeed, the other very reactive species is a monometallic magnesium species with a 2-methyl group. Is more reactive than 1 methyl and 1 chlorine, and you understand indeed it's much more nucleophilic when there is another good donor on the magnesium. So it makes a lot of sense. And with this, we can really have all of the species and all of the reactive reactions. And we understand that there are several really competitors. It's not really one much better. There are 2 which are only 2 kcal apart. They probably occur in comparison. Single electron transfer, that was fun. To get started, many people in the literature have tried to calculate the cleavage of the magnesium alkyl bond, and each time they found a very high level. So they say, how can the radical mechanism occur with barriers which are higher than 60 kcal? Experimental values are indeed 60 kcal in the methyl magnesium iodide. So it fits. How can you actually cleave a bond through a radical reaction? Well, I think the people have not thought that maybe you should start by coordinating the substrate before cleaving the bond. If you actually, in place of cleaving the magnesium methyl bond in the THF solvated system, you actually do it in the THF and substrate solvated system, the solution becomes very different. The bond dissociation energy calculated with traditional static method becomes much lower, to become around 25 here with difluoroaldehyde. We'll see another one just in the next slide. And you wonder why. It's incredibly simple. If you cleave the bond here, the single electron remains of magnesium. Magnesium is not happy to have electron. We know that it would like to get rid of electrons. It's electropositive. If the substrate is there, simply the electron will transfer on the substrate. So the lower is LUMO of the substrate, the easier will take the electron, and actually it activates the bond dissociation energy of the species in solution. So this is why indeed a lot of reactions were indeed observed with systems with very, very low reduction potential. So we look at the case of the fluorenone, which is the most extreme, heavily conjugated ketone with a very low potential. So we look at the single electron transfer, and the single electron transfer, indeed, the bond dissociation energy is indeed very low. In terms of energy, it is 16 kcal. If you think in terms of delta E, delta G, thinking that to liberate two systems, it could be even lower. And if you actually look at the nucleophilic addition, it's 14 kcal. It's much less reactive than acetaldehyde because it's just bigger. It needs to rotate, and there is a lot of I would say, internal, I would say, steric repulsion, which raises the energy through the dynamic. So indeed, we are able to show that the best of the nucleophilic addition in the case of the fluorenone is at about the same energy and probably a little higher than the single electron transfer. So indeed, the single electron transfer is going to be preferred for heavily conjugated ketone or any ketone with a very low reduction potential, which exactly fits what was said at the beginning. Sorry to come back here, that indeed single electron transfer is never occurring in any alkyl ketone. Single electron transfer is always found to be observed for reactants with low reduction potential. So we did a calculation for fluorenone. We did not do it for other one. It's just very expensive in terms of calculation. So what have we learned? We have learned here that we were able to identify species which were reactive. We were able to identify, to make a difference between single electron transfer and nucleophilic addition to know which is which. And I'm going to come to some conclusion. In general, on, I would say, use of, I would say, what does the solvent? So through the example I've shown and through the literature you can read, you can still look at reaction in gas phase. It could contain some information, but you have to be very, very careful. I would say just think about, you are never going to do a proton transfer without solvent. That was obvious. But you actually, some of the usually concerted reaction will be I would say, reasonably well described in gas phase, but you probably are not going to get good energy. So I just consider you should be very careful. If you are modeling the solvent, you need to model the solvent to get any quantitative energy profile. Only qualitative energy profile may at best be obtained in gas phase. The static model is going to be useful for many years to come because those ab initio molecular dynamic calculations are not so easy to actually do, but they are becoming more and more popular, and they are essential when you have no clue of what the solvent does. And indeed, this was the case of the transfer hydrogenation, the hydration, the hydrogenation, and of course, in all of the chemistry and alkalino and alkalino earths, I believe that nothing really realistic can be done with assuming a certain solvation. It's actually interesting that you have very little computational literature with a static model, and this is why actually it does not really, it cannot be done. Yes, it can be done. It can be done with the appropriate approach, the dynamic approach will solve it. For the Grignard reaction, what we found is that we were able to identify the nature of the Grignard species in solution, and they are much more numerous than originally thought by just a simple Schlenk equilibrium. You have to keep in mind that what reacts is not what is more stable, but that we know that in chemistry. We have known that for long, but this we were able to show that. For the reaction itself, the reaction occurs probably by several pathways in parallel, typically from a dinuclear and a mononuclear. They are two similar, they probably are both actually running in parallel, which is actually interesting because this is why maybe the selectivity of the reaction can be difficult to control. And the nucleophilic and single electron competition is simply indeed easily understood if you keep in mind that the substrate has to coordinate the magnesium before the magnesium R group is cleaved. With this, I want to show a very international group of working. So this work is done in Norway, in the Hilaras School of Hilaras School of Quantum Molecular Science, which is part of the chemistry department of Oslo. And I started actually doing that. I certainly knew nothing. I mean, I knew of the ab initio molecular dynamic. I didn't know how to do it. I actually say once in a lecture that nobody understands anything to Grignard. And this Michele Cachera was professor there already, took me, say, if you don't understand anything, let's do it together. So we are here in Tromsø at the north of Norway on a blue sky, 25 degrees outside, unusual. The work was done by German student who got his PhD in Norway, and with the help of Spanish colleague, we actually also a permanent researcher in the center. They're a very international school. It was very, very fun, and I would like to thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.